There are dozens, even hundreds of different techniques for building lasting fertility and resilience in the garden. But in my experience of growing plants from seed to harvest, nothing changes the game quite as much as indigenous microorganisms. So in this video, I'm going to walk through the entire process of IMO cultivation, step by step, stage by stage. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Taylor and I help gardeners grow in more sustainable, regenerative, and exciting ways. As you probably guessed by the length of this video, this is a detailed process, and even with as much explanation that I'm offering here, it is still not the full picture. But one way to help with that I found is to provide a resource, specifically the Beginner's Guide to Indigenous Microorganisms, or IMO, as we like to call it. You can download this free PDF by hitting the link in the description or by scanning the QR code on the screen. This resource is going to be helpful to have while you're watching the video, and it'll be a point of reference for you when you actually go to do this yourself. So feel free to grab that. We'll start with how to get a good IMO collection, referred to as IMO 1, and preserving it into what we call IMO 2. Then we'll go into how we diversify, integrate, and multiply our IMO collections. And we'll conclude with some of the various ways that we can use our culture. And all of this is explained here in the Beginner's Guide, so please go ahead and grab that if you'd like. We've released individual portions of this video so that if you want to tackle those one at a time, you can, but we also wanted to provide the whole thing in one video, so here's what you can expect from here on out. What we're about to walk through is a complex process, similar in some ways to compost making, but it starts out in the forest with collection. Collection of, you guessed it, IMOs. Once we get these, I'll show you how to preserve them through a fancy process of dehydration, and then how to take those wild microbes and build them onto a number of other media. And before we hop in, I just want to say that while it may look like this stuff just works for me, the reality is that this process took me years to get right. And part of the reason is because I didn't have anyone to walk alongside me and tell me to try again, tweak this, tweak that, and don't give up quite yet. So hopefully what I share in this video will shorten the process for you if you've struggled with this in the past, or maybe are brand new to this whole thing, in which case I should probably say, I am not the inventor of this technique. In fact, this process of IMO cultivation comes from a decades-old tradition called Korean natural farming. And Korean natural farming draws on the ancestral wisdom and insights from a wide range of ancient growing techniques from different cultures across hundreds, probably thousands of years. So I didn't come up with any of this. I am a beneficiary of the generosity and the hard work of many other growers who have put in the work to discover this stuff in the first place. So with all that said, let's hop into IMO stage 1. So let's hop into the method, and you may or may not be familiar with how this works, but I'm just going to explain it as though you've never heard of it before. Indigenous microorganisms consist largely of bacteria, fungi, nematodes, and protozoa, majoring on the fungi and bacteria. And these microbes eat various foods that supply them with the ability to multiply themselves. Generally speaking, fungi enjoy woody material and bacteria enjoy fresh green material. Both will happily feast on simple carbohydrates though, like rice. So in order to attract these microbes that we're going to find out in nature, we are going to offer them a carbohydrate in the form of a grain substance. Now, when I was first trying to collect IMO, I found it really challenging to catch it using the traditional white rice. Now, it wasn't impossible, but I would get bad collections or very limited microbial collections more often than not. And what I found is that there were other grains that actually worked a lot better for me, namely barley and whole oats. I've also found success with buckwheat and millet, and even just brown rice seems to work a bit better than white rice for me. You can check out our video on how I came to that discovery. But in essence, my advice is to think about what grains are grown in your general area and try those out. So if rice is not a crop that's grown or able to be grown in your area, perhaps you would find better luck using a different grain. For me, I just find that barley holds on to its moisture a bit better. It gets me consistently clean collections compared to white rice, which seems to go all over the board and usually dries out. Of course, this is just going to depend on your local environment and what you have available to you, and you gotta experiment cooking your grain longer or shorter, using more water or less water. All those factors matter. For me, I find that pearl barley, thoroughly rinsed of its starch and then cooked for 20 minutes, 1-to-1 in water, works best for me. For my collection containers, I've used a few different ones over the years, but the main ones that I use right now these days is a simple 4.5-inch by 9-inch cedar box that I make myself. You can check out our video on how to get a good IMO collection every time to see how I make it. This is my collection container of choice. I fill this up 1/3 to 1/2 of the way filled with steamed barley after it's cooled down and it's all set. So I want to show you a few collections that I did to give you a sense of how this works. Before doing that, I want to address something. Inevitably, you start talking about IMO and people are going to just start hopping in with their take, which I welcome. Please make your points in the comments. It's always interesting to hear from people with different opinions and point of views. I am not going to try to cover all my bases here by explaining every detail of why I'm collecting IMO in this specific way. There are a lot of ways that you can do this. This is the method that I have found the most reliable and effective. And there are a couple reasons, main reasons that I want to share for that. First of all, this is a fairly non-invasive approach. I'm essentially disturbing the local ecosystem as little as possible while getting what I consider to be a superior result. Second, I'm allowing the initial colonization to occur in the IMO's natural environment. It's a gentle, gradual sort of coercing the microbes to colonize the grain, rather than trying to force nature to bend to my will. And I think doing it this way is really elegant. It's partnering with nature and it's a deeply rewarding process. If you have another way that you like to do it, that's great. This is how I like to do it. And if you'd like to give it a try, that's what this video is for. So it was late summer when I made these collections. It's good to get multiple collections at different times of the year and in different locations so that you can really maximize that full spectrum of diversity. But even a single collection is great if you're able. I have 3 kids under the age of 5 at the time of this video, and Cassidy and I can't quite afford childcare at this point in our lives, nor do we really want to send our kids off so that we can work. So we split our work hours and we get to spend lots of times with our wonderful kids. That said, we have very busy lives, and tromping out into the woods to put out a few collection boxes is not something that naturally finds its way into my schedule. So I'm oftentimes bringing my kids along for the ride, which always makes things interesting. As I was filling these 3 boxes, you might be able to hear my 3-year-old in the background. She was pretty upset about something. Mostly, I think she just needed a nap because she ended up taking one and staying home with mom as my 4-year-old and 4-month-old came along with me. And I love getting to include my kids in this process because first of all, they love getting to participate, and also they're learning a really unique skill and honestly a worldview in regard to the way that we treat our soil and seek regenerative growing techniques. So I'm happy being a little bit less efficient with my time if it means that they get to see what I'm up to.
About INO, we make INO and we put INO on plants.
For this first collection, I wanted to check out a new location. This is a public park with a fair amount of nature. I perused the area for probably a half hour until I found this nice meadow sort of off the beaten path. And what I'm looking for here is just an area where it looks like no one has been walking around or dropping trash. I'm also looking to see that if the leaves have fallen and decomposed underneath the tree's canopy. And crucially, I'm looking for visible mycelium under the leaf litter. Now in this particular spot, it was very dry. It was late summer and we hadn't had any rainfall over the last month. So I really had to check around for quite a bit for any signs of microbial life. I also had our baby in the front pack carrier and my shins were starting to burn from squatting. So in the end, I settled for some less than ideal spots. It's hard to see on camera, but I did end up finding some twigs and leaf litter with a little bit of white covering them, and that's what I decided to place on top of my box and underneath it. After putting the boxes on the ground, I also always make sure to cover them up real nice so that they don't get discovered by a person who happens to be walking in the area. I have had my boxes found before, I'm assuming by a person, because they were just unburied and sitting out in the open. If that happens, or your collection may not be completely ruined, but it's really not the ideal. You want these boxes to be kind of sitting undisturbed as much as possible. Now I left these 3 boxes and I consider this day 0 because you really can't expect anything to happen colonization wise within the first 12 to 24 hours. I like to put out multiple boxes at once so that I can get a good shot at a good collection. And the way that I do this is by collecting 1 box at a time. You can take a sneak peek at your grain a few days in if you'd like to, but you run the risk of compromising the collection once you open the covering. There's yeasts floating around above the rice and the fungi is sensitive to disturbance. If you're going through all the trouble of getting into the woods for a collection like this, you want to do it right, in my opinion. So after a few days, 3 to be exact, I went back to retrieve my first collection box. This time I was solo. I like going in early in the morning before the sun is high, and when I picked up my first box, I was expecting a very mild collection, more immature than what I actually got. Temperatures were in the upper 50s at night to the upper 80s in the day, so it's definitely warm, but you can see here that there was some decent colonization happening. The grains were very lightly covered in fuzz. White and gray is what we're looking for here, and that's what we're seeing. The only thing is that the biological bloomage was not very intense. It hadn't covered the top of the grains to indicate a complete colonization. Typically, I'm looking for it to climb up the sides of the container a bit, and we didn't see that in this collection box. So if I had seen less development, I would have waited a few more days before retrieving the second box. But since we were seeing a good amount of saturation between the grains, it gave me the sense that we needed to go out the next day. I preserved some of the best bits from this collection just to have it. You don't have to use the whole thing. You can remove the contaminated bits like that blue and green mold. Here I just weighed out my 40 grams, about 40 grams, and then I just added brown sugar to mix it up. We'll talk about this a little bit more later on, but this is a crucial step that you want to do as soon as possible after opening your collection box. The next day I went out into the park. Luckily, it only takes me about 20 minutes to get there. And what you can see on this next collection, just about 24 hours later, is that the fuzz is covering quite a bit more of the top. It's clinging to the side of the box, and as I took it out of the container, the grains were quite infused. This was a nice surprise, considering I didn't feel super confident in the spot that I had selected in the first place. And same with the first collection, I weighed out the best parts of this collection and added an equal amount of brown sugar by weight. Now this was a sufficient collection in my opinion, but we obviously still had the third box to retrieve. So the next morning, Cassidy and I both went out to get it. We had the grandparents watch our kiddos. Something kind of random that I'll say about these collections is how warm they get when the grains get colonized. I can literally feel the heat radiating out of the bottom of the box. It's so interesting how warm it is on the bottom. Okay. Now, what's so interesting to me every time that I collect IMO is how fast the IMOs colonize and how rapidly they can develop and multiply. This third collection showed more of the clean white and gray fuzzy forest biology, and also a little bit of contamination around the edges, some yellow bits and blue-green mold. You can see a fair amount of dew and condensation on the top of the collection, and overall, as I tore into it, I felt like it may have gone over a little bit, which is totally fine. Still took out the best bits and went ahead and mixed them up in brown sugar right then and there in the forest. Something that I would highly recommend is to try to engage with your sense of smell. This particular collection smelled like beer to me, like an amber ale, and that's not always what it smells like to me. Sometimes it's garlicky, sometimes it's just really yeasty. This one smelled a little alcoholic. Kind of interesting. It actually smells like beer. You should smell that. Now, as far as the brown sugar, there is a small misconception here I found, and that is that the sugar is not actually being used as a food source exactly. Of course, it might feed the microbes a little bit, but the primary reason that we use sugar to preserve our collections is because of its ability to dehydrate the microorganisms. And this seems odd because what we actually see happen is that it becomes quite moist, almost syrupy. But that's actually the point. The sugar draws moisture out of the colonized grain substance through osmosis, and then it keeps the IMOs locked up, sort of suspended in that syrup, where they're actually unable to multiply because there's not enough air or moisture. I like to compare this to raw honey. If you know about honey, you know that it contains lots of microbes, yeasts, bacteria, enzymes, but those microbes don't ferment the honey because there's not enough moisture, there's not enough water. Once you start adding water though, the microbes can start traveling around and they feed on the sugars in the honey and they start making mead. So that's what's happening here with our IMO, and this stuff is what we call IMO stage 2. Now I wanted to share another collection that I did around this time. Again, I'm getting new collections from a different area than we've gotten them before, and I wanted to get some IMOs from a much higher elevation. So in our area of Spokane, Washington, we have Mount Spokane, and that's where we went to collect. This is a bit out of the way from where we currently reside. So for this collection, I put 4 boxes out and I collected them all at once 4 days later because I didn't want to travel an hour out and an hour back 4 days in a row. So Chose to wait 4 days after placing the boxes, which in retrospect, I probably should have waited a little bit longer. Temps were a little colder this week, plus we were at a higher elevation. Another day or two would have been a little bit better, but it was forecasted to rain and I hadn't placed any sort of rain protection over my boxes, so I felt like it would be best to go a little bit earlier. Now, before we dive into these collection boxes, I will admit that when I drove back up to the mountain, I forgot exactly where I had placed my boxes. I thought I would be able to just wing it, but there was an almost identical looking pull off to the side of the road where I had hopped out the last time. And so I literally started walking up the side of the mountain looking for where I placed my boxes and I couldn't find them. And it was at this moment that I was extremely grateful to have dropped a pin on my Maps app, because when I pulled it up, I came to realize that I'd been searching about a quarter mile down the road. And this is something that I always do no matter what, whether I think that I'll remember it or not. I always drop a pin on my map. Mark it on the map, take pictures, and I recommend that you do the same, because even after driving up the road a little bit and finding my actual collection site, it took me a sec to find the boxes. I had apparently disguised them quite well. Anyway, I packed these up, brought them home, and cracked them open, only to find a dissatisfying amount of fungal colonization. Not nothing, mind you, but not the really robust, mature collection that I was hoping for. For these boxes, I had tried out 2 with white rice and 2 with barley. Interestingly, in 2 of the boxes, 1 rice, 1 barley, I caught practically nothing at all, whereas you can see with the other boxes, I got at least some good stuff. So, as before, I picked off the fuzzy bits, mixed them up in my brown sugar, and just like that, now I've got 4 new IMO2 collections. And so now to conclude this section, I want to highlight a few of the key takeaways. And the first one being, if you have tried this or are going to try this after watching this video, please respect the environment and the area that you're collecting from by disturbing it as little as possible and leaving the site as close to its original state as possible. Scrape back the leaves to cover up the forest floor when you're done. We obviously want to respect nature that we're borrowing from. Second takeaway is to try multiple times, maybe a lot of times, to get collections from different places at different times of the year. Change up the way that you cook your grain, how much water you add, how long you cook it. All of these things matter. Another takeaway is to preserve your collection as soon as possible after removing it from the forest. Add plenty of sugar to keep those microbes on lockdown so that they don't eat themselves to death. Keep them from fermenting just yet. We'll do that when we make IMO stage 3. And one of the most important takeaways that I can recommend is to document. Take pictures, drop a dang pin, because you won't regret it if you do, and you might regret it if you don't. Don't risk it. Save yourself the hassle and heartache. If you would like to send me pictures of your collections, I would greatly appreciate that. I love receiving those from you. You can send them via email to taylor@thegriffinfamilyfarm.com. In case I didn't say it already, or if it wasn't immediately obvious, the purpose of catching and preserving these IMOs is so that we can introduce them to our garden soil. The thing is, we're not quite ready to apply these microbes to the soil yet. And a big question that I get a fair amount is, why can't we just use these right away in our garden? Especially if they're supposedly the best of the best microbes, strong and resilient and adapted to our climate. And there are a few reasons for that. And each additional stage that we take these microbes through is going to serve a certain function that will answer that question. So hang on to it. And let's get into the way that we make IMO stages 3, 4, and 5. And the way that I've really come to understand the thing that we're about to do is by breaking it up into 3 categories of ingredient. So we've got here with our IMO 2 is what we would call an inoculum. And don't let that word scare you off. An inoculum is simply something that we use to inoculate or infect something else. The something else, in this case, we're going to call a substrate. Now, at its core, that's all we need. An inoculum and a substrate mixed together will eventually become an inoculant for our garden soil. So to sum it up, an inoculum plus a substrate equals an inoculant. However, there are other ingredients that we can add that will help create the conditions that will favor the inoculum as it is inoculating the substrate. And these are what I call microbial curators. They're extra added ingredients, food sources, enzymes, hormones, and nutrients that are going to curate the environment of the substrate in which the inoculum will do its thing. I'll get practical here in a sec, but let me conclude by saying that the microbial curators for each of the stages of IMO, 3, 4, and 5, are going to stay the same. What changes is the inoculum and the substrate. To give a different example of something like this would be like sourdough bread. To make sourdough bread, you need a sourdough starter that will inoculate the rest of the dough to make the loaf. To make that starter, you combine yeast, water, and flour. The yeast comes from the air initially, but eventually it's just like the leftover starter that you had from a previous batch. The substrate is the flour, and the water provides the necessary hydration for the yeast to travel through the substrate and inoculate it properly. Once that happens, you've got your inoculant that can be used to make bread. When we make IMO 3, the inoculum, as I've already mentioned, is the IMO 2. That is our leftover yeast. And the substrate for IMO 3 is a combination of carbon-rich material and carbohydrate-rich material. These are the ingredients that we're going to combine and tend to in order to achieve our IMO 3. Now, as we transition to making IMO 4, our IMO 3 becomes our inoculum. Okay, IMO 3 is what we're using to inoculate the IMO 4 substrate, which is native garden soil. Soil that you scoop up from your property, your garden beds, your field, your food forest, wherever you're growing. That soil is the substrate for IMO 4. Once we get our IMO 4, we can either use that as our soil inoculant, or we can use it as an inoculum for yet another stage of IMO, you guessed it, IMO 5. And in this case, the IMO 4 is the inoculum, and the substrate is a compost or an animal manure or collection of crop residue. Each time we take our IMO collection through to another stage, two main things are happening. One, the microorganisms are diversifying, and two, they're multiplying. This is a very rich soil inoculant that we're making, so each time that we expand the inoculum past IMO 3, we're only going to be doubling it in size. Now, the missing piece to the puzzle is our suite of microbial curators, and for these we have 5 main ingredients that when mixed together in water create something that I like to call IMO water. I came up with that all myself, not the ingredients, the name of the mixture of the ingredients. Yep. So the ingredients are fermented plant juice, vinegar, oriental herbal nutrient, seawater, and humic acid. They're going to perform several functions as we try to get our IMO inoculum to take hold within each of the substrates. Like I said before, these microbial curators are going to be providing nutrients. They're going to help crowd out bad microorganisms. They're going to supply enzymes that will help facilitate the process of inoculation. They're doing work. But if you don't have any of these ingredients, no fret, just adding dechlorinated water alone to hydrate your IMO 3, 4, and 5 piles will do the trick. It's just, if you've got the ingredients, it's going to help them run a little bit smoother. For IMO 3, I like to start by mixing my dry ingredients and my wet ingredients separately, just like baking. For your carbon-rich materials, you've got options. You can go with wood chips, wood shavings, straw, dried leaves, dried grass clippings, shredded cardboard. The main thing, as always, is that you want these materials to be clean. And by clean, I mean you don't want a bunch of ink on your shredded cardboard. You don't want herbicides contaminating your grass clippings or straw. Just play it safe and use what is available in your area and what you know is not going to contain a lot of contaminants, because those are going to kind of throw off the microbes that you're trying to culture. For carbohydrate-rich materials, you've got multiple options. Same rules apply as for the carbon materials, clean and local if possible. Eventually, I would love to be able to grow all my own materials that I use for making IMO 3, but for now, I've got a good source of whole oats and wheat bran. You can use rice bran or spent grains. Look for things that are cheap. You can use flour if you want, but it's not really the most cost effective usually. And then an optional addition is going to be your charcoal. You don't want to overdo it. This won't count as your carbon source because the fungi won't be able to feed on it like they do the leaves and wood chips and stuff. But by adding a little bit of activated charcoal or even just regular charcoal, it's going to give those microbes more space to spread out and multiply. So it's a pretty great addition. Mix these up together. I like to do this in a wheelbarrow so that it's a little higher and easier on the old back muscles. Plus, once I'm done mixing, I can just wheel it over to wherever I'm going to let it ferment. Once I've got the dry materials mixed up, I mix the wet ingredients. And in the case of IMO 3, that includes the inoculum, right? So first things first, I make my humic acid via a very complicated set of processes. First, I take a few handfuls of homemade woody compost, I put it in a paint strainer, and then I take that tea bag and I steep it in my water and gently tap it against the side of the bucket to release the humic acid. If you have store-bought humic acid, you can use 2 ounces or 56 grams worth. I just like to do it this way because I don't have any humic acid right now, and compost contains good amounts of it. After doing this, for 4 gallons of dechlorinated water, I add in an ounce of IMO 2, and you'll notice that I'm using multiple sources of IMO 2. I've got a bit of a collection, and I want to maximize the microbial diversity, different collection sites are going to contain a slightly different profile of their microbial makeup. So I'm using several of them here. If you've only got one good one, that's all you need. And then I'm adding an ounce or 28 milliliters of FPJ and apple cider vinegar. I'm adding only a third of an ounce or around 10 mils of OHN because OHN becomes more potent as it ages. Mine is a year old, but for less than a year old OHN, you'd add half an ounce. And then for the seawater, I don't live near the ocean or any salty body of water, so I'm using my own homemade salt water made from unrefined sea salt, and I'm adding about 16 ounces of that to this 4-gallon bucket. Once this is all in there, I like to give it a good swirl and I start to hydrate my dry ingredients. Now, I wish I could give you an exact formula that would work every single time the exact same way perfectly with no variation. But the truth is the amount of IMO water that you will need to hydrate your substrate with will entirely depend on the dryness or dampness that your materials are starting out at. It'll depend on what materials you are using or what combination. It'll also depend on your climate and what you find works best for you as you ferment your materials. But as a general rule of thumb, we're shooting for a level of dampness similar to what you'd get the ingredients in a hot compost pile too. Something that clumps when it's squeezed but falls apart when it's tossed. You don't want it crazy sopping wet, but you don't want any dry pockets. Get it hydrated, but not dripping a ton. I like to make mine a tiny bit wetter than what I've seen other people do. That's because the climate that we're growing in is crazy dry, and without that moisture, our piles dry out in moments. It does help when the outdoor temperatures are a little bit more temperate. I made this particular IMO 3 pile when it was still fairly warm out, but just starting to cool down at the end of the summer. Anyway, you'll have to get a feel for it by actually doing it. Don't just watch me do this, experience this for yourself. Now, once I've got this all mixed up and hydrated and dumped out onto its fermentation zone, we want to make sure that this pile is properly oriented, dimensionally speaking. I shoot for between 8 to 16 inches high, give or take a few inches. For this pile size, the height of the pile is going to dictate how well the materials hang onto the heat, and that's going to start generating. If you're forming your pile in direct sunlight or where it gets hit for a few hours out of the day, you will want to keep your pile mulched with a carbon-rich material like your leaves or straw or whatever you've got. This is going to keep the pile moisture levels managed, and it's going to protect the microbes on the outer edges from getting zapped and killed off by the ball fire in the sky. The spot that I am making my piles in here is fully shaded for 100% of the day, so I'm leaving it uncovered. And y'all, I just have to say, after having made many of these piles, dozens, it still genuinely surprises me and excites me when they heat up. You're most likely going to want to invest in a compost thermometer for this project. You can use a meat thermometer if you want, but compost thermometers are really not that expensive these days. What you're going to see happen as this pile sits is the temperature is going to begin to rise. After a day, you should start to see the pile heat up past 90, maybe higher. Depending on the outdoor temps in your area, the pile might heat up even faster. Whatever happens, I want to encourage you to monitor the crap out of this pile, because the whole point of doing this, making IMO 3, is to diversify and multiply your microbes. You're going to get weird looks from your neighbors, okay, especially if people are like walking by as you film a pile of what looks like dried leaves and wood shavings. But oh boy, they have no idea what is happening there. What is happening there? Well, the IMOs that we caught in the forest and preserved in brown sugar are getting the chance to feast on a new food source. In my case, wheat bran, oats, wood shavings, and leaf mold. And what happens when they start feeding is that they adapt, multiply, and select for new traits that allow them to better digest the materials. Different types of fungi and bacteria are suited to digest different types of food. Now, what happens is that while they go into the feeding frenzy, they start generating heat because they're sweating. Literally, they're respirating carbon dioxide, water vapor, and heat. But here's the thing, to maximize and maintain microbial diversity, we need to keep the temperatures of the environment below 120 degrees Fahrenheit or 49 degrees Celsius. And ideally, we get into that above 110 range or 43 C. So the goal here really is to create a pile that heats up to between 110 and stays under 120 for as long as possible. The pile will eventually cool down on its own after the microbes finish their feeding frenzy, but it's likely, very likely, like maybe completely likely, that you will have to manually manage the temperature of your pile. And the reason that I say this is because if you don't, the pile is going to overheat. It's going to kill off those mesophilic microbes, and it's going to start getting dominated by thermophilic bacteria who won't chill out. No pun intended, and they're going to steal the space for themselves. So fungal diversity is greatly limited when this thing creeps much past 120 Fahrenheit, 49 Celsius, and that's why when you notice your pile, whether you're making IMO 3, 4, or 5, you're gonna wanna spread it out. And I do this literally every time. You're gonna spread it out with a rake or a shovel and let the heat dissipate for a good 30 minutes or so. Once the materials have cooled off, you're going to want to repile that so that it can heat back up and those robust microbes can continue to get established in that mesophilic zone. Now this whole process, watching the pile heat up, seeing the fuzzy biology consume the pile, the whole thing is really exciting to me, even after having done it quite a bit. But you know who also really likes IMO is chickens. These gals are stoked to be a part of it because they know what's up. They're going to get some of this stuff in their pen before long. But not quite yet. Eventually, like I said, the pile is going to cool down on its own, and you can bag it up or store it or use it right away to make IMO 4. Make sure that you store all of your IMO 3 and beyond in breathable containers out of direct sunlight. I like burlap because I've got a good source from a local coffee shop owner. Cedar chests are pretty common, so I've heard. I have never owned a cedar chest. Maybe I will one day and I can use that. But for now, I've got burlap sacks. Now, a little summary. The purpose of IMO 3 is to further diversify your IMO collection. IMO 4 is where that diversified set of wild microbes are going to get to know your local garden microbes. It's like you're hosting a mixer so that people can get to know each other. You want the indigenous microorganisms to get to know the garden microorganisms so that they can properly integrate once they're applied to the garden soil. Otherwise, you run the risk of local nematodes and protozoa gobbling them up and not allowing them to establish their new home. They need to integrate prior to being used. So we're gonna do the same thing that we did with our IMO 3. We're gonna mix up our dry ingredients first. This time, it just so happens that our inoculum is one of the dry ingredients, AKA IMO 3. So we're gonna mix these up equal parts, and then we'll prepare our IMO water, this time sans IMO 2, because it's already in there. And then we're gonna hydrate. Same as before, mix it up really good, make sure that there's no dry spots if possible. I find that sometimes I need to wait a little bit, give it some time, mix it again, give it some more time and feel it with my hands, how damp or dry the materials are. It can take time for the dry materials to soak up the water, but once you've got a good consistency, it's time, same as before, to make a pile. Stick the thermometer in there, let it rock. Now for this pile, I made it toward the middle of our fall season where temps were just starting to creep downward into the upper 30s. And so it took a little bit for the temperatures to rise. In cases like this, and I found this especially relevant for IMO 4, since soil is pretty dense material, it can help to do some light aeration by just sticking a pitchfork into the pile and lifting up some chunks to help incorporate air into the pile. This helps it to not go anaerobic also. I'm not trying to mix up the pile too much here, and I want to keep these chunks intact. You can see there's tons of inoculation happening, great microbial development. It is so fun to see this happen in real time. Anyway, after aerating the pile a bit, I let it sit for a few more hours, and sure enough, it heated right up to about 119. Now at this point, it was approaching sundown, and I was about to go to bed in a few hours, so I went ahead and preemptively mixed up and spread out the pile so that it was just a tad shorter. This is what I typically do for young piles so that they don't overheat in the middle of the night. But I didn't have to worry about this one because I came out the next morning and we were looking at about 96 degrees. The next day I went to aerate it a bit more and show you some of these fungal aggregates that are forming. And again, leave these be. Don't break them up if you can. I just wanted to show you guys what you can look for. Now, same as IMO 3, this pile came down temperature-wise all on its own. And at this point, it pretty much looks like soil. But this substance right here is what we can use to top dress our garden beds with. We can use it for a variety of different purposes as an inoculant. But as promised, we can also use it as the inoculum for IMO stage 5. And that's what we did here. For our IMO 5, our dry ingredients are IMO 4, our inoculum, and homemade compost, which is our substrate. We mixed them together, hydrated them with our IMO water, and piled it up. Now, beyond further diversifying the microbes from IMO 4, we're also expanding the actual volume of our inoculant by doing this. So making IMO 5 is another way that we can double it, make it go a little bit further. Of course, if you've got finished IMO 4 and you've managed to keep the temperatures controlled and it's your first batch ever, you may not want risking overheating it just to make IMO 5. So if you just barely made it to IMO 4, feel free to use that. IMO 5 is not a necessary step. I'm just doing it because I feel relatively confident in managing my pile. So before we conclude this video, I want to add a few personal comments and observations that I've made about this stuff. First of all, much like getting a good IMO 1 collection, IMO 3, 4, and 5 can be tricky. It took me quite a while to figure out how to get the ratios and hydration just right for my exact environment, my climate. And while I was figuring that out, it was really hard for me to manage the temperatures of the piles. I kept spiking way past 120, which isn't the end of the world if it goes above 120 for 30 minutes, but I was like losing control of it for long periods of time. And it just felt like I was never quite gonna be able to get it right. And even after I successfully managed my first pile, subsequent piles I made still overheated, and I had to keep working on it. Until now, I feel pretty confident about my ratios, my sense of how the piles are gonna do. And I know this sounds odd, but I can literally walk outside and smell my IMO 3 pile, and based on how it smells, I kind of know if it's overheated or not, even without looking at it. It has a very pleasant, comforting, but distinct smell to me. Point is, this is both a very unique skill, not one that you necessarily want to brag about to your coworkers, but it is nonetheless a valuable one because making IMO 4 and 5 yields you a crazy powerful soil inoculant that is impossible to purchase anywhere unless someone in your area is willing to make some for you using your own soil. If you are struggling to keep your pile maintained, temperature-wise, there are a few factors that you'll want to look for, and those are hydration, height, and ratios. For the ratios, I'm referring to the carbon to carbohydrate source ratio in IMO 3, and in my opinion and experience, IMO 3 is the one that is most likely to overheat due to an excess of carbohydrates or not enough carbon material. If your pile keeps heating up super quickly and seems like it's out of control, try adding more carbon material to your next pile to keep it cooler. On the other hand, if your pile struggles to heat up, it could be due to a lack of carbohydrate. Moisture is another key factor. If a pile isn't properly hydrated, it can struggle to heat up, and if a pile is overhydrated, it can start to smell ammonia-like, and that could be a sign that the pile is going anaerobic and the less favorable bacteria are taking over the pile. If that happens, flip it, spread it out so you can dry out a little bit, and you might be able to salvage the pile. Height is also a critical factor when it comes to a pile under or overheating. And basically, if you want to try to get your pile to heat up faster, pile your materials higher. And if you want it to keep your temps controlled and a bit lower, try spreading out your pile a little bit thinner. Overall, make sure that you don't compress your piles. You want them to be fluffed up and aerated while also holding on to moisture. It's kind of one of those interesting balances. Now it's at this time, for the first time ever, we have a sponsor for this video, y'all. We made it. And that sponsor, believe it or not, is me. Just kidding. Well, kind of, not really. This group is sponsored by the Natural Gardening Group. If you are on this crazy journey of growing food or flowers with an eye on the future, one of the best investments that you can make in yourself is in the form of a supportive community. And with the Natural Gardening Group, not only do you get the chance to share your growing journey alongside others who are on a similar path to you, you also get access to custom-made, custom-fit gardening resources that will help you in your journey. You can learn at your own pace, or you can take one of our more intensive courses. If you're just starting out, you can explore our gardening fundamentals course, for instance. If you're looking to expand your understanding of more of the advanced soil building techniques, we've got resources for you. You can easily ask the community questions without fear of judgment or being made fun of for how dumb your question was. In the Natural Gardening Group, we get it. Growing plants is hard, and sometimes feels like everyone but you knows what to do. This is where the strength of a supportive community comes in clutch. I am completely available to help everyone in the group. You can direct message me or others in the group with questions that you have about all things natural growing. If you want to sign up, you can go to thegriffinfamilyfarm.com/group-trial, or much easier, hit the link in the description, or even easier still, scan the code on the screen to get a limited time free trial of the group. Thank you to the Natural Gardening Group, aka me and our community, for sponsoring this video. And with that, let's hop back in. Now, once we've arrived at the point where we have got our finished IMO 4 or 5, we're ready to start applying it. Application can happen any time of year, but the most helpful and maybe convenient times seem to be right at the beginning of the season and toward the end. Typically, it's recommended to apply IMO 4 or 5 at a rate of around 1/4 pound per 100 square feet, 15 kilograms per 100 square meters. But you can also just try to eyeball it by kind of doing a light top dressing over the soil so that just covering the soil surface in most areas. A great time to apply IMO 4 is right before cover crop termination. If you can spread it out over the soil and then chop and drop your cover crop to mulch over the top, this is a great way to either mid-season or at the end of the season to get the IMOs established in your soil. They can feed on the cover crop and on any other carbon mulch that you spread over these beds. The main thing is that we want to keep them covered whenever we apply IMO. We don't want the sun scorching this stuff. We want to cover it up, and also preferably we're trying to water it into the soil so that the microbes can let gravity carry them downward. Don't till it into the soil. the best way to get them into the soil, in my opinion, is just to water them in and cover them up. If you want to take it a step further, you can also do a little double application by making this additional IMO stage called Liquid IMO, where, shocker, we create a liquid form of IMO that can then be sprayed across the soil or on plants directly. To make Liquid IMO real simple, we're just going to whip up a batch of our IMO water. So we add our ingredients, our vinegar, fermented plant juice, our humic acid, seawater, and oriental herbal nutrient, and then the finishing touch, our IMO 4 or 5. For this, I recommend a half cup approximately of IMO 4 per gallon of IMO water. And the way we want to add this to the water is by placing it in a paint strainer or another type of fine mesh bag and then steeping it in our IMO water. Now, just steeping it is not going to be quite enough. This technique is a sort of riff on the classic aerated compost tea technique. So we're going to need a bubbler. You can use a heavy-duty fish tank bubbler or a compost tea aerator, just some way to keep the microorganisms in the water from going anaerobic. If they get stinky and smell a little putrid through this process, it might mean that the brew has gone anaerobic, and that's going to limit a lot of the microbial diversity that we worked so hard to achieve. I like to pop one of the bubbler hoses directly into the fine mesh bag with the IMO 4, just to make sure that it gets blasted with air, and then you want to just make sure that the bottom of the bucket gets airflow from the bubbler hoses, because the IMO can settle at the bottom, and you don't want sediment really building up there. Aerate this bucket of liquid IMO for between 24 to 48 hours and then pour it into your sprayer. I use a backpack sprayer because I got tired of applying it manually, but pump sprayers totally work. And if you're growing on a smaller scale or you just want to do some spot treatment, you can totally just bottle this up, put it in a spray bottle. Main thing is you need to use it ASAP, because once you pull out those tubes, it's going to start its trajectory downward toward going anaerobic. You want to apply it while those aerobic microbes are still alive. And this is a really great way, as I already said, to apply IMO to the foliage of your plants, but it's also as an addition to the soil, as a way to wet down your recent IMO 4 application in solid form. Just helps the microbes get established. Now, generally, you want to apply your IMO 4 liberally in the early years. That said, a little goes a long way. Remember, this is just like a soil inoculant, so it's going to expand its influence over time and over repeated applications, but you can also use your IMO 4 as a chicken bedding inoculant or for your chicken coop or pen. It's a really great way to keep down the odors. You can use it as a culture to kickstart your chicken feed if you're into fermenting your chicken feed, which I highly recommend if you've got chickens. Just a handful of this stuff in a bucket of feed, mixed up, adding water is going to get you some really nice fermented feed after a day or two. You can also add in other nutrients from the IMO water if you have them. And just to reiterate again, if you don't have any of these extra ingredients, don't fret, still make it. This is really just a use it if you got it sort of situation. Now, first of all, if you made it this far in the video, congrats, and thank you for spending so much time with me. I really appreciate your attention. I don't take it for granted. I hope that you received a lot of valuable help so far and insights from this video, and I wanted to conclude the video by just kind of taking stock of the ground that we've covered and looking at what comes next. So for this last portion of the video, I want to take some time to offer some general and summarizing encouragements within this process. There are not too many videos on this platform, resources when it comes to IMO, but every part of this process, from the collection to the diversification and application, something that I always want to remind viewers of, first of all, is that this isn't a smooth process. It's not as smooth as you might be led to believe if you're just watching this or for the first time, or if maybe you've watched other videos, or if you haven't tried this yourself. The reality is that most of you who end up actually doing this or have done it, tried it, and struggled will find yourself saying it's not worth the effort. There's got to be easier ways to get the same results. Maybe you're saying this is just a way that people can feel smart about themselves and make other people feel bad. Or maybe this whole technique is just a bit over the top and unnecessary. And I wrestle with this because both sides of the story could be true here. And by that I just mean it's possible that this is just not going to be necessary or even helpful for your garden. And I also think that there's a bit of a danger of consuming so much gardening advice or just internet advice in general without stopping and trying the thing for yourself. It's dangerous kind of going through the cycle of not slowing down and taking the time to learn the process of whatever it is fully. This approach to soil building is a really unique one. And what I actually want to showcase more often is my failures within this process. I wasn't able to show it fully in this video because with all the reps under my belt, I've kind of got my methods fine-tuned, but that doesn't mean that I still don't make mistakes in the process, and you're just less likely to see that. I just don't think about sharing a lot of that. And that's actually, I think, from the feedback and the comments that I've received, I think that that was a lot of the appeal of the beginner's guide to IMO video that we released last year. That video, I'll just repeat, was not necessarily intended on teaching beginners how to do IMO as much as it was just documenting my experience as a beginner learning how to do the whole IMO thing. And I made way more mistakes along the way, even in that video, where the whole point was just to showcase the mistakes. I had to really focus and iterate leading up to that video, kind of documenting my experience. But a lot of that didn't even make it into the video in the end. Same with this video. You're not seeing the struggle and the journey of discovery in real time. And the reason that I say that is because I really don't want you to get the impression that this is easy. Maybe you don't get that impression after having watched the whole video. But if you find yourself thinking after watching this that you could give this thing a try and maybe get it perfect on your first try, it's probably going to be important to temper your expectations. This just requires trial and error. This almost requires you to get bad collections of IMO, to overheat your IMO 3 pile, to underheat your IMO 4 pile, to make a batch of liquid IMO that goes anaerobic. This whole thing is technical and precise and a little bit fragile, and honestly, it's not for everyone. I want to speak to those of you who do want to make this work for you. Is it worth it? This is a question that I ask in my book, A Home Gardener's Guide to Korean Natural Farming. This is a question that I have asked a lot as I explored IMO cultivation. Is it actually worth it? And unfortunately, I can't show you a side-by-side comparison of 5 years using IMO 4 in one garden plot and 5 years of only using compost in a nearby plot. I do hope to be able to do that on this channel over the next 5 to 10 years. But for the time being, I only have what I can see with my own eyes and the scientific theory to back it up. So what I've been able to see with my own eyes is that through using IMO to start 5 gardens over the past few years, it appears to be a major Kickstarter in the process, especially where perennials are grown. I've seen healthy and persistent fungal cultures in the soil. I've seen disease be stifled and not take hold. I've seen soil tilth be transformed rapidly, and by rapidly, I mean change from one season to the next. Real change. And so, let's talk about why this might be, because I think there's a lot of potential rebuttals to IMO. First, you might get someone like Garden Myths legend Robert Pavlis saying microbes don't really matter. And I don't want to speak for him. Maybe he just means that microbes aren't something we can really understand and prove. They have a legitimate role in the gardening. But then you got people saying, microbes matter, but we can get all we need from sources like compost, worm castings, worm tea, or these special aerated blends. One step closer to IMO believers, you might get someone saying that a Jadam microbial solution does the trick, and there's no need for IMO 4. And the thing is here, each of these people could have it right. It's very hard to know and hard to wade through all of the abundant gardening advice on YouTube. You could find that compost is the input that gets you pretty much all the soil remediation results that you need. And if that's the case, feel free to stop there. I think for a lot of people, that's probably the case. And the reason for that, especially if you are mostly growing veggies and annual flowers year after year, you probably can get away with the bacterial dominant cultures present in compost. And I've discussed why this is quite a bit on this channel, but I'll just share a little bit again. Bacteria is one of the categories of microorganisms that acts very quickly. Springs to life quickly in disturbed soil. It performs a ton of different functions across species and subspecies of bacteria, and multiplies itself very quickly. And what do you know? It dies off really quickly. So persistent bacterial cultures are hard to track from the research that I've done. It seems like they may really need to be regularly reapplied season after season, maybe more frequently even. And there's probably more nuance to it than just that. But by and large, bacteria are the fast-acting workers in our garden that help fix nitrogen in the soil, help plants sequester carbon, defend plants from disease, deliver plant nutrients to root systems, and much, much more. Beneficial bacteria are a really great thing to have in your garden soil and on your plants. And to a certain extent, you can't really help it. Populations can diminish if you're applying herbicides and synthetic fertilizers, but overall, these guys are going to find their way back into your soil, especially if you're top dressing your garden beds with compost or spraying your plants with aerated compost or worm tea, or incorporating worm castings into your soil. For this reason, bacteria can spring to action quickly when a seed germinates in the ground can do all of its stuff, and then it'll back off when the growing season is done. Now, the other big microorganism that we've got in our gardens, at least some of us, is fungi, right? Fungi are sort of an inverse of sorts of bacteria, generally speaking. Fungi take a while to get established in recently disturbed soil. A lot of fungi also require a plant host to survive, especially those in the mycorrhizal category. And you may have heard of this. Mycorrhizal fungi is a bit of a buzzword in eco-conscious gardening circles, and it refers to the fungi that tap into plant root systems and connect plants to a broader, larger network of plants. It's sort of like connecting your computer to the internet. Your computer could do a whole bunch of stuff all on its own, but now it's got a whole lot more resources and connections because it's connected to every other computer connected to the internet. Mycorrhizal fungi networks connect plants to each other, allowing them to share nutrients, receive immune support, and all sorts of signals from the other plants in their area. Now, without a plant host, the mycorrhizal fungi go away. They're symbiotic creatures. Now, this is great news for gardeners majoring on perennials because that symbiotic relationship is maintained month to month, year to year. And what that means for the mycorrhizal cultures is that they are able to persist in the soil. Now, without a plant host, they aren't necessarily dead in the water. These cultures will create spores and leave behind remnants that can spring back to action the next season when they sense plants are back in the ground. But for permaculturalists looking to establish a food forest or just folks looking to get an orchard started, these fungal cultures can be kind of a game changer. And this stuff will establish itself naturally in these kinds of systems. But so where does IMO come in? IMO is a collection of both fungi and bacteria and other organisms, as I mentioned earlier. But both of these cultures fit largely into the decomposition category of microorganism. And this is one that I haven't mentioned a ton yet. Decomposer microbes largely rely on organic matter for their food source, and a lot of what they do is break down this organic matter into bioavailable plant nutrients. They also really help foster healthy soil conditions, such as soil tilth and immune health. They're acidifying the environment as they decompose the materials. They help break up soil compaction and all sorts of other things that make the environment hospitable for plants and other microorganisms to exist. This is both really complex and also my explanation is super simple description of all that's happening there. You don't really need to understand most of that if you can just get that the plant-soil microbe dynamic is symbiotic. The whole process is interdependent and relies on each other, which is really cool. IMO 1 collections are going to contain some mycorrhizal spores, but the majority of what they're containing is those saprophytic fungi and lactic acid bacteria that have lived in the soil, feeding on the leaf litter and other organic material for season after season after season. They've evolved and adapted and fine-tuned themselves to the point where the symbiotic relationships just work. The decomposers are doing great work to create the environmental conditions for the other microorganisms and the plant roots to engage in their exchanges and seek mutual health. They're all mutually benefiting each other. That's why we carefully preserve the fungi and bacteria that we caught from the forest in IMO 1. Why we gradually expand it across new substrates and multiply it slowly. It's to keep those cultures alive until they're ready to be introduced to their new home. And the thing with microorganisms is that they are constantly adapting to their conditions and seeking to bring equilibrium. They're at work to both survive their conditions and support the other functions at work. If you'd like to learn more about this, I recommend that you check out the book, several books actually, Teaming with Microbes and The Hidden Half of Nature, which we'll drop links to if you're interested in those. All of that is to say that at a certain point, I think the best way to learn about this stuff is just to do it, apply it, see how it works in and for your garden and your other growing endeavors. Friends, if you made it to the end, thank you for taking this journey with me. I look forward to sharing more progress reports along the way as we see what IMO can do in the long term. Download our beginner's guide to IMO if you haven't already, and if you want to get a sense of the big picture framework that IMO fits into, you will want to check out our Home Gardener's Guide to Korean Natural Farming video. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.